By the beginning of the 18th century, the religious wars were largely over and nation-states dominated Europe. The large chunk of land labeled Germany is misleading. After the 30 Years' War, Germany was broken into more than 300 small states. Spain continued its economic and political decline, and Italy remained fragmented and economically weak as the center of economic power moved, as I've mentioned before, to the North Atlantic. Rome remained a cultural center, however, and artists continued to seek out opportunities to study in Rome. France's most prestigious prize for young artists was the Prix de Rome, which financed an extended stay in the Eternal City. England was in political and economic ascendancy. Its parliamentary government, while still quite corrupt, was still fairer and more efficient than virtually any government on the continent. And its maritime trade and eventually industrial innovation would give Britain Europe's most powerful economy. But we're going to be focusing on France quite a bit in this unit, and French politics at this point in history were complicated. Louis XIV, as I'd explained in my last lecture, had destroyed Protestantism, secured France's boundaries, and created a unified nation-state. But his wars came close to bankrupting the country. More importantly, his strategy of essentially keeping French aristocrats in the elegant holding cell that was the Palace of Versailles fell apart under his successors, Louis XV and Louis XVI. The aristocracy reestablished their dominance, moved back to their Paris homes, and if anything, they tightened their economic grip over the countryside. I think you know how the story of this selfish and self-indulgent aristocracy ends, but meanwhile, those aristocrats were sure having fun. And nothing captures the frivolous last days of the French aristocracy better than the art of what is called the Rococo period. The leading Rococo painter was Watteau, who has completely disappeared from the College Board list. Still, I could imagine you're being asked to identify the art historical period of a Watteau painting, so I'm going to show you a few. This was Watteau's exhibition piece for entry into the French Royal Academy. Academies dominated the art scene in many countries, but above all in France, and we'll be talking more about them in the unit. This painting didn't fit into the usual Royal Academy categories, but so enchanted the judges that they inaugurated a new category, the Fête Galante, which was basically an outdoor party where the participants engaged in flirtation and generally adultery. I mentioned that Watteau deeply admired Rubens. Oops, in a slide I think I've now deleted. Oh well. This painting comes somewhere close in theme to the Watteau painting, but what difference do you notice? Baroque art is heavier, more dramatic, more solid. The colors are brighter. One of the art historians I listened to described Rococo as Baroque with the wind taken out of its sails. Baroque art figures tend to be smaller, the colors are more pastel, the subject matter is usually deliberately lighter, and the love is less serious and usually illicit. So I am going to get to our required work in a moment, I promise. But first, as we move into this unit, I want you to know that there was a huge fight going on in the art world over which was more important, line or color. You haven't seen any paintings by Poussin. He's a French painter who has also dropped off the course. But you should be able to see that his composition from the painting on the left relies more heavily on line. And you see a Rubens on the right, one of the Marie de Medici cycle. So we will see line regain prominence when we get to neoclassical art in my next lecture. But for now, let me just note that in the Rococo era, Rubens pretty much won. It's all about swirling color. This may seem an odd introduction to the swing, but I think this movie opening offers quite a brilliant vision of the decadent French nobility in the Rococo era. The movie is based on a famous novel, Dangerous Liaison. It was published in 1782, just 7 years before the French Revolution broke out. The two main characters we see here in their movie versions are rivals and ex-lovers who use seduction basically as a cruel game designed to humiliate and degrade other people. So the clip is the movie's opening, and it shows the elaborate dressing ritual and the artificial costuming of France's aristocrats. On Moodle, you'll also find a trailer for the movie, which I'm hoping will tempt you. The movie is rated R, and the trailer probably should have been, so check with your parents, okay? This painting takes Rococo to a whole new level of poof, a poof of pink, as our Khan Academy experts put it. The fellow hiding in the bushes is up to no good, and his lady friend seems pretty pleased by that. One rather odd detail, the swing is possibly being pushed by a bishop. We know from an original source that that's what the patron requested. But there's a dispute over whether Fragonard was really painting a bishop here or just an unattractive layman. Still, the painting may offer a not-so-subtle hint about the church's alliance with a decadent aristocracy. Stay tuned for Voltaire. The patron also asked that his mistress be the model for the work, but art historians think that Fragonard did not agree to this request either. The alternative title of the work is, quote, Happy Accidents of the Swing, unquote. So what would you guess is the happy accident? Is it that she's lost her shoe, or is that losing her shoe gives a chance for her lover to look up her skirt, which means, was it really an accident? The lost shoe may also symbolize the loss of virginity. So what do you make of the hat? It's actually a bergère hat, a shepherdess hat, which adds an element of irony since shepherds are normally associated with virtue because they live close to nature, uncorrupted by the temptations of the city. It may also be a shout out to the popular philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whom you'll encounter in the reading for tomorrow's lesson. Rousseau believed that civilization corrupted human beings and that they were happiest and most virtuous when living closer to nature, more closer to their original state in the wild. Marie Antoinette famously played at being a shepherd at her own little country home, Petit Trianon, which you saw in the video. The operative word here is played, and indeed Rococo reminds me of mannerism. It's really all about masks. Pop culture for 40. Where does the image on the right come from? Okay, I haven't seen it, but I gather that the Disney movie Frozen has a character named Anna who swings in front of a Fragonard wannabe. Note that Disney omitted the dubious lover looking up her skirts. They are just spoil sports. Now, we're going to return to this work in our last unit, but I thought it made sense to introduce it here since the Nigerian-British artist has created a quite deliberate homage to the Fragonard painting. So what's missing from this work? Well, her head, a not very subtle reference to what's going to happen to a lot of these frivolous aristocrats in the French Revolution. But what else is missing and why? Well, we don't see the dubious older man pushing the swing or the lover sneaking around in the bushes. So who's looking up her skirt? We are. Like much installation art, we, the viewers, are actively participating in the scene. We're part of the art. We're performance art, if you will. And therefore, we are performing an act of voyeurism. I mentioned earlier in this lecture that art will display more cross-cultural influence. So what strange cross-cultural tale does the cloth she's wearing tell? Well, the Dutch wax textiles she's dressed in are an Indonesian batik design that was initially produced by Asian textile workers under the direction of British industrialists for West African consumers. Ooh. Now, African artists would develop these designs further, and later they came to symbolize African culture and even the African drive for independence. I've included another example of this cloth on the upper right. On the internet, it was advertised as Dutch wax African kente cloth made in Worcester, Massachusetts. The popular term for this kind of cultural borrowing or imitation has become cultural appropriation. So what is the connotation of the word appropriation? By the way, just vocabulary note, denotation is the dictionary meaning. Connotation are sort of the feelings that it conjures up, what kinds of emotions or attitudes are associated with the word. So if I appropriate your cell phone, are you going to be happy? Okay, full disclosure time. I find the term cultural appropriation very laden and sometimes unfairly laden with negative implications. Basically, I enjoy living in a world where white girls with straight hair sometimes get cornrows to liven up their look, and where fajitas sometimes get wrapped in pita bread so they're less likely to fall out. West Africans, for example, seem to have admired the Dutch wax designs and then carried the art form even further. I would say the Italians did a great thing with the tomatoes from the New World. So I would call this cultural exchange and think the world is better for it, but I'm guessing that this artist doesn't agree. So here's another interesting example from an article I'm probably going to assign later in the course. A Brazilian designer has borrowed an Amazon rainforest tribe's native dress and tattoos for his spring 2016 fashion collection. The tribe's getting royalties, so I'd say everyone wins this one. But what if the designer had just used the designs without sharing the spoils that he'd just seen a photo on National Geographic? Would that be cultural exchange, or would it be inappropriate cultural appropriation? When is borrowing ideas from another culture insulting? When is it inappropriate? I don't know if you're going to have time to stop and talk about this now. We're going to try very hard to make time for the discussion later. Meanwhile, staying on the theme of high fashion, here's another Rococo artist that I want to introduce, even though he too didn't make the list. Francois Boucher's patron was King Louis XV's extremely influential mistress, Madame de Pompadour. He painted this portrait of her, and again you see the lush but cultivated landscape. There's clearly a statue there. This is a garden, not Mother Nature. You see the little lapdog and all that pink frivolity and then some. And here's an especially over-the-top Boucher example that I think was in your reading. I could easily imagine the College Board asking you to identify the art historical period of this work they have in the past. It's Rococo to the core. So this is one of those summary slides that I've only slightly modified, and I didn't actually show you any Rococo sculpture or architecture. It's small, white, and covered with gilt. Rococo art is lighthearted and frivolous. The content is less likely to be religious, more likely to be amorous. The major patrons were aristocrats, not the church. The colors are light and pastel, and we see little, if any, chiaroscuro. So it's hardly surprising that a generation of artists, especially those who were unsympathetic with the frivolous aristocracy, decided to take another path. But before we travel down that path ourselves and explore the art of the Enlightenment, I want to talk about one more required work that bridges the gap in some ways between Rococo and Enlightenment art. Elizabeth Louise Vigée LeBrun was a very successful painter in an era when women had a hard time breaking into the art world. She wasn't alone. We've seen works by other successful women painters, especially in the last unit. Vigée LeBrun made money painting aristocrats. She also hung out with aristocrats, and she supported their right to preserve their rule, their dominance in society. Her political views, quite conservative, forced her from France when the revolution broke out, actually probably her associates even more than her political views. But she continued to make a living from aristocratic portraits, especially of the Russian nobility. After the revolution, after Napoleon, she did eventually return to France. Her most famous subject and a personal friend was the notorious French queen Marie Antoinette. Vigée LeBrun painted more than 30 portraits of Marie Antoinette. Here's one of the most famous. Sorry about my phone ringing in the background. So in what ways does this portrait show a Rococo style, and in what ways does it introduce Rousseauian themes? Well, we see the pastel colors, the pink roses, the over-the-top costumes, but we also see a setting in nature that isn't quite so clearly a designed artificial garden. This painting actually had a political objective. Can you guess what it was? This was an 18th century effort at political spin. Vigée LeBrun was trying to make Marie Antoinette a more sympathetic figure to the French public, which was increasingly subjecting her to harsh criticism. Note the date. This was just 2 years before the revolution broke well. Spoiler alert. The spin didn't work, and things did not work out for Marie Antoinette. So here's an earlier self-portrait which could jump right out of a Fragonard painting, except that the artist is looking straight at us, self-confident in her art and in her status as one of Europe's leading artists as a young woman, and as one of the very few women admitted to the French Academy. By the way, her membership in the Academy was rescinded during the French Revolution because the revolutionaries, following the theories of Rousseau, believed that men and women had different minds and belonged in different spheres. Any guess where Rousseau thought women belonged? As you probably guessed, in the home with their children, not in the Royal Academy. And here's a later portrait, this time with her own daughter. How would you compare it with the portrait of Marie Antoinette? Now, this artist has dropped off the College Board list, although she has appeared on past AP exams, so she might appear on yours. Adelaide Labille-Guiard was the other woman who was admitted to the French Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. Note that, like so many women painters we've seen, she painted herself painting, and in this case, teaching painting. Interestingly, this artist supported the revolution, and she painted a number of revolutionaries. That's Robespierre on the right. He was the leading figure in the Reign of Terror that sent so many of her former patrons to the guillotine. But Adelaide Labille-Guiard got kicked out of the Royal Academy, too. Her sound politics from a revolutionary standpoint notwithstanding, she was still a female. We're going to talk about the revolutionary attitude toward women pretty soon. So Vigée LeBrun painted this self-portrait after she went into exile in Rome. And by the way, her husband didn't leave with her, but stayed behind to support the revolution. We don't know for certain whom she's painting, but most art historians think it was Marie Antoinette. So what do you think? Does this seem like a Rococo work? What kind of personality does it convey? Or does her naturalism and her determination to make her way as an individual signal that she's more a figure of the Enlightenment? I think the answer is probably both. But it's to the Enlightenment that we turn next.